Hey, what's up? It's Sep from Unison. Welcome to part 2 out of 3 of this video series where I'm going to show you how to make a professional quality tech house track. So if you haven't watched part 1, you're going to want to watch that before we dive into this, because in this video we're going to be covering the mixing in detail and the processing. So in the first video I went over the overview of the track, how it's structured. So you're going to want to see what we're working with and how everything's laid out before we dive into the details here. But just in case, I'll play the final product for you, just a bit of the build and the drop. Cool, so let's begin with the drums. So I'll go to the drop where everything's in full action. Actually, let's start in the intro. Simple. Let's listen to the kicks here. So the kick is 3 layers. There's a low layer, mid layer, and high layer. And I found that layering them like this made a powerful round kick that really helps drive the track. Sometimes I only use 1 layer, but in this case, these 3 layers fit together perfectly. So the low layer is rolled off around 400 hertz here. And then we have this mid layer, which I cut off around 700. And then the very top layer I cut off around 1K. And then all 3 together, it sounds like this. So that's the kick. Next, we move on to the hat. Here's the processing I did on that. Let's loop this. So for your hats, you want to cut off the low end quite a bit, usually up to 1K. Depends on what kind of hi-hat you're working with, but in this case, I wanted to cut it off around 800. Second thing I used is this plugin called Micro Shift, and it helps widen things. So I wanted the hi-hats wider in the mix. They were too centered, so I put this on. I put stuck with the default settings, except I put the delay to tight because this is a hi-hat. You don't want things loose. And I put the mix to 50% on this. Something else you can do is create a bus and put this plugin with full wet on that bus, and then use the sends to send it to it. But in this case, I just placed it straight on the track and it worked well. So let's hear this with and without processing. Not a huge difference. This hi-hat is really good to begin with. So that's another thing I mentioned in the last video. If you start with high quality sounds, you won't have to do that much processing. Nothing more than EQ, saturation, bit of compression. So that's the hi-hat. Let's move on to the clap here. So the clap has 2 layers. This is the first layer, which has more of that snap to it. I wanted to keep it thick, so I cut it off around 250. If you want more of a thin clap, you can go all the way up to 800. But in this case, I wanted this to keep that smack, that weight. So I did that. And again, I put Micro Shift with the same settings to make it wider as well. The second clap we have here is processed the same as the hi-hat. So this is the layer on top of the clap, has less low end, but look how it sounds like soloed and then with the layer. So it makes it a lot more punchy, and this little shaker thing it has at the end helps drive the drum groove when we play everything together. Now this is just a shaker that hits every beat, and for a shaker you only really want it to, the whole point of a shaker is pretty much to add brightness. So I don't want any low end in this, so I cut it off all the way up to 3K and added Micro Shift to it for some width. We're gonna go through the side chaining in a little bit, but yeah, everything for the most part is side chained to the kick slightly. So this is the shaker, and let's play all these sounds we just went through together. So already you have a beautiful, solid drum groove that drives the track. This is the foundation. But one other thing that we're gonna add is this stick, which really brings the groove together. So I did kind of some cool stuff on this one. I cut off the low end at 250 microshift, but something I did here is normally it was hitting in the same spot every time and it was getting stale. What I like to do with stuff like this is add some movement to it, and how I did it this time is I put an auto pan plugin. I set the rate to 1/4. If you hear it mixed 100%, you'll see what it does. So obviously that's too extreme, so I dialed it back to 15%, but it still has that effect of increasing the movement. And then when you put it all together, this is what it sounds like. So that's the base of our track. Let's move on to the bass. So the drums and the bass are the most important thing in tech house. This bass, I did some crazy processing on to get it right. So let's go through this right now. First, let's check it out. I'm gonna play it in the drop because in these first sections, the low end is cut off. As we mentioned in the previous video, you don't want to give everything away at the beginning. So here's what it sounds like in full effect. Let's go to drop 1. Here we go. All right, so let's go through these processors one by one. So to begin with, we're using a serum preset from the Unison Tech House collection for serum, which is coming out tomorrow. It's this bass called Huffle, and just how it is how I've used it for our foundation. So this is what it sounds like originally. So it's good, but in this track, since we have such a beefy kick and drums, we want the bass to be at that level. So the first thing, actually add this to all my basses. It's a Waves plugin called R-Bass, and it's just like magic for basses. It adds harmonics, it just fattens your bass in an amazing way. And what you do is play with this intensity knob. I just left it at 0. You can play around and see what works best, but look at the difference with and without. Immediately it brings it forward and makes it a lot deeper. So the second thing is a compressor, and there's different types of compressors and you want to use them for different reasons. This compressor is usually used mainly on vocals because it's very smooth, but this bass is also really smooth, so I didn't want a compressor that's too punchy and that would interfere with the flow of my bass. So this one worked really well. And something else is that the volume was fluctuating way too much between the notes on this bass because there's such a diverse range of the notes we're playing here. It's not like some tech house tracks, you'll only stay within 3 semitones the whole track, but since this has a lot of variation, I had to use heavy compression to make all the notes the same volume. So let's check out what this is doing. So immediately brings everything forward again, and as you can see, the release on the compressor here is really long, but it works well with this bass. So I added another one. Don't be afraid to go a little bit crazy, you know? Sometimes I'll add a saturator and I'll duplicate it twice and switch up the settings a bit, and you know, it can work really well. So don't limit yourself to one compressor. Try to keep things simple, but don't be afraid to also do some experimentation because sometimes it works out amazing. Yeah, so I got actually pissed off that the notes were fluctuating, so I just slammed this pretty much like a limiter and it fixed the problem. Next thing we're gonna add, this is one of my favorite plugins. This saturator I use on almost every sound with different settings. I love it because it has so much in it and it's so simple. So it's the Decapitator by Sound Toys. Highly recommend their plugins. I also use their delay. Microshift was from them as well. Great plugin company. I recommend Waves and Sound Toys all day. So look at the difference with and without this. So obviously it's way too distorted, but we're going to take care of that with the EQ after this. So here are the settings I used. So this button is crazy. So first of all, it has 5 different settings. A is usually good for, you know, normal use. E will push it up forward and add brightness. And these ones I don't use too much. I usually stick with these 2. I like them a lot. So we punished it. That's the huge thing we did. We added a bit of drive, low cut it around 60. Like this EQ that comes with this is so useful. When you low cut a bass just a little bit, it has a really cool effect of bringing out the harmonics. Also, we put this dark setting, which also brings out harmonics and tames the high end. And we didn't touch this here, and it's mixed in 100%. Now, since there's way too much high end in this, we're gonna use this EQ to make it deep. So check it with and without. Huge difference. So the first point is cutting off the high end at 150. And I also made the Q a little bit higher than usual because adding some harmonics to this range can really help your bass mix in with your kick and your drums nicely. Second thing is there's too much of this specific harmonic here. So I dipped that. And third thing is to add more power, I boosted 100 Hertz by 2 dB. So let's hear the bass and the drums together. So already we have the foundation for our track. The next thing that we'll go through is the vocals here. So this is a sample from Mado's Artist Series pack, and the only processing we did on this is effects and the Decapitator to bring it forward and add some life to it. So let's check it out with and without this plugin here. Own it, own it, own it, own it. Definitely good idea to use this plugin on this sound here. We're gonna go through all the reverbs and delays in a sec after we cover the basics of this mix. So that's the only processing I'm doing on the vocals other than the delays and reverbs, which we're gonna go through in a bit. So the next thing is the effects here. So let's go through the effects through the break, into the build, and in the drop. So the first effect that we have in the track is this camera effect. And for this, we just cut off the low end and added a Decapitator. As I said, I use this on pretty much every sound except my kick. Usually I don't do too much processing on my kick, except when I'm layering, I just use the EQ. I try to find a kick that sounds good right out of the box. And Matroda's Artist Series pack has the best kicks I've ever used myself, so I highly recommend that if you're looking for better kicks. So I always use different settings. I literally just throw this on, it comes on default, and I listen and move the knobs until it sounds how I like it. So this is the first effect we have. The second effect is this swish effect, which helps with the transitioning. And for this, I cut off the low end at 1K. we have this camera effect coming again, same processing, and then we have this riser in the background. So let's go through this one. So I'm doing a couple things here. First thing is I'm cutting off the low end at 500. Second thing is decapitator to add some more life to it. And then I'm automating the volume. In most DAWs, you can fade it like this, but sometimes if you're doing a longer fade, this section is too quiet, like you can't hear it at all. So instead, I've placed a utility plugin here, and I'm bringing it from -8 dB to 0, and already it's pretty quiet in the mix, because if I tried bringing it up and it interfered with all the other elements, and putting it at a low volume, at a low level, helped, you know, create that tension in the build, but at the same time not interfering with other things. So this is what I did with that. And then in the second half of the build-up, we have this uplifter here. So for this, I low cut it and it was too bright, so I also high cut it at 4K. So it still has that nice effect, but it's also tamed on the low and high end. So let's listen to this right here. So let's move into the drop now. So we have this effect that hits, it's sidechained a bit more heavily, and it's cut off at 1K again. You don't want your effects to interfere with your bass and kick and low end elements. You want it to just cover the high end and add that space. All right, so next thing that comes in the second half of the drop is this top loop. And for this, I literally just wanted, the whole point of it was to add brightness to the second half of the drop. So I cut off the low end all the way to 7K. I added some brightness, and I went heavy with the auto pan because I wanted this to also add movement, just like a, you know, extra spice for the second half of the drop to keep it engaging. And this auto pan is on 1/16, so every shaker hit, it's moving left and right. Mixed it at 60%. Now, the next thing that comes in this section is this laser. So again, it's a preset from the Tech House collection that's coming out tomorrow, and there's tons of other effects in here, but this one was worked the best for this purpose here. So again, decapitator, I punished this one. Helps give it some life. Micro shift for that width, and some EQing here, a little bit more precise. So I low cut it at 300. It had too much boxiness. If something like sounds boxy, then you want to cut it at 500. Helps it, you know, be a little bit more in the background so it doesn't interfere. It's just an element that's supposed to add some spice. It's not meant to take all the attention. So that helped with that. And it was, since this shaker is covering all the high end, I didn't want this to interfere with it. So I did a sharp cut at 14.5K over here, and it's sidechained as well. So those are the two new things that come in the second half of the drop. So let's listen to it all together. So a little bit of a switch up of the vocal chops, same as it was in the build here. It's always nice to, you know, switch up the chop pattern throughout the track. You don't want to keep it the same or else people get bored. And okay, so now we're moving into the second break, and the new thing that comes in here is this new lead, which works really well. So again, it's a preset from the Tech House collection, and we got some good processing going on here. So again, I'm going to go through all the reverbs and delays and the processing I did on the entire track after we go through everything individually and in context with each other. I'm going to go through these things, exactly what processing I used, how each sound was made, and then I'm going to go through the, that extra level of mixing you can do to get the difference between an average track and a professional sounding track. So here's what we did on the lead. Let me show you what it sounded like raw. So as you can tell, it's too much in the background and it doesn't have enough power. So first thing I did is put the decapitator on punish, and I used the E setting because I wanted a bit of a more brighter saturation. Right away, that adds more power. Micro shift for that width. Actually, this isn't even doing any. Yeah. So this was actually just enabled doing nothing. So yeah, you might want to check your plugins at the end to see if they're actually working. Sometimes even a plugin added with no settings makes something sound a bit different. So it might have done that, but that's why I might have done it. But yeah, we'll keep it on anyways. The third thing is, if you want like more intense width and better control over how you do it, this is the plugin I recommend, Ozone Imager. This is the Ozone 6 Imager, and what you can do, this is a multi-band imager, which means that you can widen and narrow certain frequency bands individually. So check this out. So that's that mid section, high mids, and the top. So yeah, I didn't want to widen anything below 500, so I kept that the same, and I just boosted these three bands 100%. So let's check out the difference. Definitely moves out to the sides. The reason why I did this is because with the bass is taking up the middle section, and since this is a lower octave lead, I didn't want it to interfere with it. So this gives them that space and creates that separation and makes the mix clean. The next thing we added to this lead is another decapitator. This one's not in punish mode. I just felt like it needed more brightness. It had too much low end, so I low cut it with this, and I put on the E setting and added a bit of drive. And then last but not least, I cut it off at 200 Hertz just to make sure we didn't have any lingering low end frequencies after doing the saturation, so it didn't interfere with our bass. All the other elements are the same as the first build. Now let's go into the second drop here and see what it sounds like when it hits. Cool, so as you can tell, this drop adds a lot more power to the second drop. You don't want to bring it in right away in the first drop. You want to establish the feel, the vibe, and then add things progressively, and then take them out as the track nears the end. So let's see what other elements we have here. I think we went through the processing on everything. So yeah, as I mentioned in part one, there's not too many layers in this track, and you don't need too many layers to make a good track, especially in Tech House. I think there's about 18 layers or 20 layers here, and it works great because all the sounds are high quality to begin with. As you can see, I'm not doing anything too crazy on the processing. I'm just making things a bit better. I'm adding a bit of saturation, compression, EQing all the low end out of stuff that doesn't need it. That's important. The reason why that's important is because it's you might not think it makes that much of a difference on one track, but if you do it on everything, at the end of your mix, you're gonna have a lot more headroom for mastering, which means that you can push your track harder into the limiter and get a louder, commercially loud track and a better result with your mastering, because it leaves each element to the frequencies that it's meant to occupy. So now let's go through some of the let's go through the effects actually. Let's go through these buses that I've made. So what I actually do, and what I recommend you do, is set up your default template project, which means that every time you open up your software, either Ableton or Logic, Cubase, FL Studio, whatever you use, stuff will load that you've predetermined. So what happens when I load a default session is I already have these set up. I have a short reverb, a reverb for drums, which is actually even shorter. I have a medium reverb, which is around 1.8 seconds decay time, a longer verb, which is around 3 seconds decay time. I have this delay, which has no feedback, but I'm using it on the vocals. We'll take a look at that in a second. And if I need to add something specific to that track, I'll do it. So for this track, I added this slap delay specific for this. I didn't start with that in my default template. And then lastly, I have this bus, which is for widening. So anything I need to widen that needs, at first I use micro shift usually. Secondly, I'll use the ozone. And if something still needs width, I'll send it to this bus. But, there's lots of ways to create width, and this one specifically is called the Haas effect. It's where you place a very short delay on the left and right side of with no feedback. What I found to work best is 15 milliseconds on the left and 30 on the right side. So let me just show you what this does. So that's without it. So it adds a lot more width. And the next thing, I'll actually go through all these reverbs here so you can see the settings. This is my favorite reverb plugin, Valhalla Room. I would recommend in Ableton you don't use your default reverb plugin. It just sounds cheap. Reverb is one of those things, same with saturation, that you want to use high quality plugins for, that were, these people spent years just to develop one plugin, so it's going to be better than your default in-house plugin. If you can't get access to this, then sure, you can use your default plugins, but you're going to get way better results for specific types of plugins to use third-party ones that are better designed. So as I mentioned, the short reverb is around 1.2 seconds. And I always cut off the low end on my reverbs. This is very important because if you leave the low end on stuff that doesn't need it, if you're sending, like some kind of, you're sending a lot of tracks to it, the low end's going to add up and it's going to muddy up your mix. So this is just something that's worked better. You can use one EQ, but I cut it off at 250 hertz first, and then there's usually some left. So again, I cut it off at 500. I just found this to work better. And also I sidechain my reverbs to the kick so they don't linger around and muddy up my mix. The drum reverb, I use the same low cutting on all the reverbs and most of the delays. So this is a very short reverb. The only purpose of this is to add a bit more space and add more cohesiveness to the drums. So let me play all the drums with this reverb. I don't add it to the kick, just the high-end drums. So that's the reverb soloed. As you can see, look at it when I don't cut off the low end. Way too messy. So this will really mess up your mix if you don't do this. When I discovered how to do this, like actually adding some processing to your buses, really helped me clean up my mixes, and it can do the same for you. So this is all it's doing. Doesn't sound like much, but in context it helps everything meld together, or else things don't sound cohesive. You can see it's too dry without it. Now we're gonna add this. Yeah. So next one, medium verb. This is what I use for mostly effects and some leads. I said this was 1.8 seconds, but it's actually around 2 seconds. So this is the medium verb. What we're using it on is, I believe, the lead that comes in the second drop. We'll get to that in a second. And then we have this long verb, which is the longest one, around 3 seconds. And for the first few reverb, for the short verb and the drum verb, I use a setting that's usually a room. Those are better for drums and stuff that you want not to sound like it's too much spatial. And then for the medium verb, I really like this Sulaco preset. It's a hall reverb. If you don't have this exact preset, you can just pick any hall reverb and it'll do fine. And then finally, for the long reverb, I use either a large hall or some kind of chamber. I recommend using the same reverb plugin for your whole track. Like, don't use this reverb and also some other ones, because the space of your track is very important, and it's important for everything to meld together and sound like it belongs in the same track. So using the same plugin for reverb is a great way to make sure that stays the case. Next thing we have is this delay. I'll play it with the vocal. This is what we're mainly using it on. So as you can see, it's a very short delay, but it adds width and it helps fill out the mix. Let me play it in the section where there's no other effects here. Yeah, so that's what that's doing. Again, I'm low cutting it. This time I used 1 EQ, and we have this slap delay here, which is active on the transitions, and this helps smoothen the transition. So let me play you a section where this is going on. It goes right here. So this is what it's doing. And in case you don't already do this, make sure you put your reverbs and delays on buses, on send tracks, because if you put them directly on the track, you're losing your original signal. It's actually taking away from your original signal, and if you use it on too many things, it'll just make your mix washy. So make sure you create buses for your reverbs and delays, and also it allows you to add processing to them specifically. Like the low cutting on the EQ, you can't do that if you place it right on the track, unless your reverb has that functionality. But again, you're taking away from the original signal. So I highly recommend you create buses for time-based effects. So that's what that delay is doing. And then this Haas effect, we went through it real quick. We're actually not using it. Okay, we're using it on the vocals, but nothing else. So the vocals needed that, extreme width. So that's what I used it on. Let's see what that's doing. So that's it soloed. As you can see, it's completely wide. By the way, excuse the lag. If it's lagging sometimes, this screen capture software captures audio exactly how it's coming out of Ableton in full quality. So it's a bit CPU intensive, and I have a lot of plugins running on this session, so bear with me on that. The next thing, okay, so now that we've covered all the effects individually, we're going to see how we're actually using them. So on the drums, as I said, I don't go crazy in tech house. I just use the drum verb to add that room reverb to make it all sound cohesive. That's all I'm doing on there. For the bass, I'm not using any reverb. I wanted to keep it dry. For the vocals, I'm using this short verb to add, a bit of space, but not too much. I'm putting this delay to add the width and also fill out the gaps between the vocal chops. And thirdly, I'm using the Haas effect to make it even wider. Another thing I'm doing with this vocal is throughout the breaks and builds, I'm automating the slap delay. So the delay is getting stronger and stronger throughout the build until this last thing where I completely cut it off and then the drop hits. So let's check out how this works. So yeah, that helps increase the tension throughout the build. It's a great thing you can do on leads or vocals or effects. In this case, this slap delay worked really well, automating it on the vocals and also on the transitions to the breaks. On the drop lead that comes in the second half of the track, I've done a few things with the reverb. So we're using a medium verb for this one because I needed it a bit more spatial, especially as it's introduced. I felt like when I brought it in dry, it was too harsh. So let's check this out. So it makes it kind of sound like a foghorn. It's like, it's coming from the distance, and then as it gets to the drop, it becomes dry. So I've automated this. I made it in Ableton. You can hold option on your Mac, and you can, instead of having it a straight line, you can make it a bit more natural and shape it to how you want it. So in this case, I kept the reverb decently high until the second half of the build, until it really started to get drier. So I'm automating the slap delay on this too throughout the build to increase that tension. And it's really cool when you make your track super wet in the build, and then when it drops, it becomes dry. It really creates that contrast and makes your drop hit way harder. Otherwise, it can get boring and stale really quickly. Now on this laser, I just used a bit of short reverb and delay. It already usually on the synth, I'll take off the delay and reverb and add it myself, but this has a very unique delay to it. It's like almost part of the sound, so I kept it on, and I didn't need to add too much other stuff to it. And this, I actually think we forgot to go over this one, but this hits on the drop and the second half of the drop both times. And I mentioned in the first part, this helps add a lot of space and impact to your drop. So again, I'll play it with and without, and you'll notice the difference. And then without. So it's basically intro or drop or intro. Like it's a huge difference. So you definitely, if you're having your other elements are more dry, you want to create this one. You want to use something like this to balance it out. So there's actually no reverb or delay because this sample comes with it already. Didn't need any external processing. On this swish, same thing. Didn't need any external reverbs or delays. On this tube riser, just needed a bit of space. As I mentioned earlier, I automated the volume with the utility plugin. You don't want to automate your volume with your track volume, because if you do that, then your faders are locked in. So if you wanted to bring up the level up and down, you can't do it because your faders are locked in. So if you use a plugin, a gain plugin for Ableton, it's called utility. You can automate the levels and then also bring it up and down in case something's too loud or too quiet later on. So that's what I did with that. Added a bit of space with the short reverb. For this one, I wanted to keep it dry so it could cut off suddenly. And then for this DLSR camera effect, I added some drum verb and a little bit more of the short reverb to give it that space, that camera vibe. So that's the base of the mix. Now we're gonna go to some tricks that you can use to really, to spice up your mix and make it sound way better than a normal mix. So before we do that, as for the side chain, let me explain this real quick. So for a side chain, you want to use a kick that is pretty short. You want to use something that, preferably is around this kind of length, so that when you're side chaining, it's only ducking the attack portion of that sound. This is true for tech house. In other genres, sometimes you can have a longer kick for the side chain, but for this one, since none of the kicks I was using were short enough, I brought another kick in just for the purpose of the side chain. And this is actually muted, so it's all the tracks that are being side chained, such as the bass, are routed to that track called SC, side chain. And these are the settings I use for every time. Like, this is just what I found to work best. I use the default Ableton side chain. It works amazing. Pretty short attack, very short release. Make sure the threshold is all the way down, and the only thing I play with is the ratio, depending on how hard I want it to be sidechained. So let's actually take a look at the difference that makes with the bass if I play around with that. Yep, so in this case, 2:1 ratio worked the best. So now let's get into the more those tactics I was just talking about. So this is called the build-up trick, and this is what you can do to make your drops hit twice as hard, pretty much. So let's go to the build. I do this on every single build, and I use a bit of different settings depending on what the track needs, but this is the exact rack I use. First, so basically what this is going to do is throughout the build, we're going to bring the track down in volume. We're going to make it more mono. We're going to bring it to the center. We're going to make it wet by automating a reverb, and we're going to cut out a lot of the low frequencies. And right before the drop hits, we're going to remove all these effects suddenly, and then when the drop hits, the build rack is going to be deactivated, and the drop's going to hit hard. So first of all, let's start with the volume automation. So throughout the build, I bring it from normal down to -1.43. You usually don't want to go more than -2, because that'll make too much of a difference. Like, people will actually have to turn down their volume when the drop hits, but this is enough that it's not really a problem in that sense. It just makes the drop hit way harder. So this is the first step. So it comes back into full volume when this vocal sample hits right there. The next thing is we're using ozone, and as I showed you earlier, it comes with a multi-band, but what you can do is just right click and remove all the bands for this purpose and make it into one band, so you can widen or narrow the entire track, all the frequency bands. So throughout this build, let me go here. It starts normal, and then it comes all the way down to it gets 30% more narrow, and then again right before the drop, it comes back on that vocal sample. The next thing is this reverb that we're automating. So let's see what this is doing. So we're automating the mix on this reverb. So the actual settings for the reverb, we're using a large room, pretty long decay. you want it to really wash out the drop. So yeah, in this case you want it to be very washy. So this works well, and it starts out very slow. Like this part, you know, we're introducing the track, so I didn't want to go too heavy with the washiness. As it, you know, as these effects start to come in, as this riser starts to come in, it really starts to wash it up. And then bam, when the drop comes in dry, hits way harder. And then the final thing we're doing is we're cutting out the low frequencies throughout the build up. So we're cutting all the way up to 435 hertz, which means by the end of the build up, there's pretty much no bass. And that means that when the bass comes in full force, the impact's going to be way higher. So I'm going to play the build up and drop for you with and without this rack. So first I'll play it without. So as you can see, number one, there's no variety. It was very stale. When the drop hit, it was the same level as the build. You know, there's no spatial changes. Things didn't, you know, get wet or dry, and the bass was, everything was just stale. And now look at it with this rack, with all these things being automated. Yeah, much better. So you're always going to want to use this in your build-ups. Remember, first, you want to bring the volume down and put it back in the drop. Second thing, you want to make it narrower throughout the build, put it back in the drop. You want to wash it out and then make it dry. Make sure the reverb doesn't carry on into the drop. So you want to actually turn off this entire rack when the drop hits to make sure nothing's lingering in there, so it hits clean. And then you want to automate the lower frequencies and then bring it back in the drop. So that will make a huge difference in how hard your drops hit. That's a technique I learned from one of my mentors, and ever since I started applying that, my tracks just went to the next level. And the last thing that we're doing on the entire track is, in certain sections, we're cutting out the low end out of everything. So as you can see, we're doing it here. So this is what it sounds like without it. So just cutting out the low end, it's great for introducing new sections. So as I mentioned in part one, you want to switch something up every 4 bars. And so the first time over here, we're using this vocal sample. And the second time, we're actually cutting out the low end. It again helps to create variation and keep things interesting, because you're constantly taking out the bass, putting it back in, switching things up. So that's the full mix. That's how everything's mixed, all the plugins that I'm using. And as for levels, I basically set the kick to around -10 dB. And once it's set at that, I just adjust everything else accordingly. I go through the drums, I adjust those levels, and then I bring in the bass, I put that at the right level, and then everything else, and I do the effects last. But usually as I'm producing, I'm moving around the levels, so usually I don't have to worry about that too much. Something that you can do is, I have it set so every new track I make comes in at -12 dB by default, and this makes sure that while I'm producing, I have enough headroom for mastering. I found -12 is good. It usually leaves you with 6 dBs of headroom, which is perfect for mastering, and we're going to go through that in the next video. I'm going to show you the entire mastering chain, and you're going to be blown away on how crazy of a difference, or it's basically going to put this on steroids. So we're going to go through that in the next part in depth. And so yeah, you want to use that low cut on the master for certain sections. And yeah, that's about it. We're gonna, in the next part, we're gonna go through the mastering, exactly how that's done, and then you'll be able to make a professional level tech house track from scratch. You'll know exactly what you need to do. Again, if you have any questions, leave them below this video. I'll go through and answer them myself. Any questions you have about this, about tech house, about the mix, anything that I might have forgot to cover, let me know. So stay tuned for the next part that's coming out tomorrow, and I'll see you in there.